Chapter 1. The Border of Drayden and Scalia. Round 2307. Third Pass. She had no idea how long she'd been there. She propped herself up on her elbows, coughing up water and spluttering. I'm alive! I escaped! She was lying on the edge of a river, washed up on the bank. Her clothes were ripped and torn, full of sand and dirt. That priestess! She was going to kill me! She tried! Gemma shook her head and wiped the muck out of her eyes. She coughed again, pulling herself up to her knees and looking around. The river was a gentle bend behind her, the bank soft and shallow, water lapping about her. It was a far cry from the foaming torrent she had thrown herself into. But it worked. I got away. Gemma recalled how a young priestess had saved her from the torture inflicted on her fellow prisoners, how she had feigned unconsciousness as she was carried out, and how she had been flown out of the city of Dane on the back of a dak. She brought the young priestess to mind. There was one particular vivid memory: blue eyes and dark black hair. At great risk to herself, the priestess had managed to smuggle Gemma out of Drayden and flown her to the borders, leaving her there to make her own way into Scalia and to freedom. Gemma remembered what she had said. I've come as far as I dare. You must make your own way now. Gemma nodded, shedding the heavy riding gear. The priestess handed her a sack of provisions. Be quick. It's only a few stretches' march to Verezia from here, she said. Hide in the forests and don't let yourself be seen in the open until you're close. Thank you, Gemma replied, for everything. Just stay alive, the priestess answered. That's the only thanks I need. Beware the priestesses. Don't use your gift if you can. It will bring attention to you. But what of you? Gemma asked. Do not fear for me, she replied. Gemma hoisted the sack. Why? She asked. Why did you save me? The priestess licked her lips. For Scalia. Gemma frowned. There's no time to explain, the priestess said, gesturing for her to go. I'm of Scalia myself. Quickly! We may have been followed. Run and hide! The memory faded. It left more questions unanswered. Gemma still didn't understand what had happened. How could a priestess be of Scalia? What did the woman mean? Maybe she had been stolen from Scalia too and had become a priestess? Whatever it was that had driven her to this daring rescue, Gemma was grateful to her. Then she shivered, recalling what had happened next. A second priestess had appeared once the first had gone, this one with a shock of red hair and a fierce expression. Gemma had tried to run, but pain savagely cramped up her thigh. She had fallen, rolling into the tall rushes at the edge of the river, hearing the rushing water nearby. When Gemma had looked up, the second priestess was there, her staff jutting forward at Gemma's throat. That memory was full of fear. Don't move, the priestess said. I will make this painless. Please, don't hurt me, please. Gemma saw the priestess roll her eyes and then stretch out her hand, palm outwards. She's going to torture me, kill me. Gemma had tried to scream, but found she couldn't. Her whole body was caught in the priestess' strange power. Then, like a burning knife cutting to her skull, she heard words. Who are you? Gemma. My name is Gemma. Please. Why did she rescue you? I don't know. There was more pain, but she couldn't cry out. Why did she rescue you? Gemma hadn't been able to stop the priestess from invading her memories. The conversation was replayed. Gemma could sense the red-haired priestess's astonishment at what she'd found in Gemma's memory. Then the priestess's mental grip slackened. Gemma didn't pause. She stumbled up to her feet and ran. The river wasn't far away. She reached a rocky edge, pausing before throwing herself over the precipice. She felt the priestess clasp at her mind, but the grip was faint and unsure. Wind roared in her ears. She hit the water hard. It was freezing, and the current dragged her along and down. There was a brief sensation of pain. Perhaps the priestess had tried to attack her again, but then it was gone. Soon there was nothing but the chilled torrent churning about her. It was all she could do to drag her head above water to catch a breath before she was swept under again. Her body crashed against unseen objects. Every moment she expected to be dashed against a rock and for her life to end, and every time she came up, gasping, she thought it would be her last. Her arms and legs ached as she struggled. Just as she thought she would drown, she felt the current slacken, and then she forced the memories out of her mind and sat up. I must have passed out and washed up on the bank. She took a good look around her. The river was wide and slow now, the water still lapping at her feet. She felt stiff and bruised, but a quick check seemed to indicate she wasn't hurt. At least nothing was broken. She could feel the warmth of Lakai on her, drying out what remained of her clothes. She felt her heart hammer in her chest. That priestess might be looking for me. I've got to get away, got to hide. The first priestess had told her to travel shadewards into Scalia. She looked behind her to see the warm disk of Lakai visible over the opposite bank. Before her the forest was thick and dense. She got to her feet, nursing her stiff legs, and staggered into the vegetation. Within it was dark. She had to wait for her eyes to adjust to the gloom. The tall shades carried on as far as she could see. So wearily, she began to walk. Lord Krennic stood atop the veranda of his home. It was a grand affair, mimicking the architecture of the capital city of his homeland, Varezia in Scalia. Built of white stone on the banks of a river, it overlooked his lands, a series of well-cultivated fields bordered by the deeper forests of Scalia, which stretched out sunward and shade-right to the limits of vision. His lands bordered another land to the sunward, that of the priestesses, Drayden itself. Not that there's much distinction now. Scalia belongs to them. He looked to the shadeward. A few dozen marks away lay the capital itself. Varezia was an ancient city, built in ages long forgotten, using techniques that no crafters could match in modern times. Much of it was empty and abandoned. It housed far fewer people than it could hold, and fewer now than in recent rounds. And the priestesses saw to that. Scalia had been its own kingdom just a round before. Old King Marek had ruled for many rounds, a time of relative peace, though the king had a strange, mercurial side to him. He had always counselled complete obeisance to the wishes of the Drayden priestesses to the sunward. He always obeyed their commands, to send the cream of their young women to that strange land every 5 rounds. But the priestesses had not been satisfied with the last tithe. They had demanded more, and came to enforce their mandate. And with the news of their arrival, old King Marek had breathed his last. His son, Auric, had taken over, a man many Scalians had great respect and fondness for. Much of the aristocracy were less enamoured, for Auric was a man of few words and straightforward thinking, whereas his father had ears for their schemes and politics. And then the war came. Lord Krennic hadn't been present in the city when the priestesses had descended and the fires rose. He had ridden in on seeing the fires. The battle had been short and brutal. All was lost before he had even arrived. Varezia was left in flames. King Auric and his half-brother Torrin were dead, and according to the stories, his daughter Lady Lyanna had been kidnapped never to be seen again. Hundreds of refugees had spilled out of the city and into his lands, looking for shelter and food, having lost everything in the attack. It wasn't long before the lords were summoned by the priestesses. Krennic had looked on while Lord Sequan defied the will of the High Priestess herself, a woman who called herself Narina Helios. Sequan had faced her down and paid the penalty. The others had watched as he was crushed down to his knees, tortured and dispatched by the High Priestess's otherworldly powers. None had dared to defy her again. So she thinks. Krennic permitted himself a smile. It was clear that direct confrontation was not the way. The priestess's abilities were way beyond anything anyone in Scalia could hope to counter. Sequon had been brave, but foolish. He had achieved nothing but his own death. If the priestesses were to be resisted, it had to be by more subtle means. Krennic had heard some talk about a conflict with an island far out in the sea to the sunright. That problem was occupying the priestesses. Perhaps something has not gone to plan. The priestesses who remained couldn't be challenged directly, but it was easy enough to ensure they were kept busy with the minutiae of Scalia administration. The priestesses' intentions were the same as before. They were seeking more young women like themselves, now with a great deal of urgency. Krennic knew of the old 5-round tithe, how high-born girls from each aristocratic family had been summoned by order of the king and sent to Drayden, never to be seen again. Young women were still being caught by the priestesses and wrenched from their families, subjected to some strange check, and then either being released or taken away by Dak, presumably to Drayden. According to the rumours, many women, regardless of where they were born, had the potential to manifest powers such as the priestesses displayed. And the priestesses are taking our women, our kin, then brainwashing them, indoctrinating them in their ways, turning our own against us. Whatever this power was, it was the core of the priestess' purpose. If we could retain these powers, perhaps we could defy them and reclaim our homeland from them. And such, behind closed doors, had been the thinking of the lords of Scalia. Krennic looked up, seeing one of the Dax circling in the sky above. It was descending in sweeping arcs. He quietened his thoughts, unsure whether the priestesses above would be able to hear what he was thinking. The limits of their powers weren't known. But at least I knew this one was coming. He strode forward across the veranda, waiting for the large creature to land. It came down with a heavy thump, raising a gust of wind as it backflapped its wings to reduce its speed. The priestess aboard leapt down with a live movement and strode towards him. She was dressed in leather armour as was custom for the priestesses, though it was covered in a dark cloak. She held a staff, the priestess's primary weapon, in her right hand. Krennic knew it was called a kai. "A fine stretch," Krennic said, with a bow. "I come to search your lands," the priestess replied. "Again?" Krennic asked. "You did so barely a pass ago. No more girls have been born or come of age in such a short time?" The priestess stepped closer, her expression one of annoyance and arrogance. "Do you defy me?" she snapped. "Not at all," Krennic replied. "I merely fear you'll waste your time." "My time is not wasted," the priestess replied. "Prepare food and water and follow me." Krennic bowed and gestured for her to proceed. The priestess strode across the veranda and entered his house, Krennic following behind. He gestured to his staff and they went to prepare provisions for his visitor. "How goes your search?" Krennic asked. "Well enough," the priestess snapped at him. "I had some talk of trouble in faraway lands," Krennic said. "I hope it's been dealt with." "We will deal with them in the same way we have dealt with Scalia," the priestess returned, her pace not slackening. "Resistance to our rule is foolishness." "So, not dealt with yet. Interesting." "Varezia was humbled in a single stretch," Krennic observed. "Surely these adversaries of yours have already been subdued." The priestess glared at him, but didn't deign to reply. "So, there do exist some who can defy the priestesses. Who are they? And how have they managed it?" The priestess continued her walk through the corridors of Krennic's house. Wherever she encountered a woman, she would stretch out her hand, her fingers reaching forward. The women would stand obediently, knowing that any defiance would be punished with a pulsing headache. The priestess was disappointed with each one, turning on her heel with a tut or a sigh before moving on, with Krennic trying to keep pace behind her. She came to the end of her search of the rooms. "Are there no others?" she demanded. "None within the household," Krennic said. "Stable hands and urchins in the fields, perhaps, if you wish to—" The priestess turned to him. "I will not traipse through muck and filth. I will be back in 5 stretches. Have every woman in your household, from the youngest to the oldest, assembled for my inspection at the first chime on that stretch." "All of them?" Krennic asked in dismay. "Every single one," the priestess replied, emphasizing each word with a curl of her lips. "And they should be clean as well." Of course," Krennic said. "It shall be done as you request." The priestess turned on her heel, striding away, her dark gown billowing out behind her. The servants who had brought food and drink scattered out of her way. She ignored them completely and strode to the veranda, mounting her deck. With a sharp cry, it arched its back, and with its wings flapping mightily, rose out of sight. Krennic watched it go before picking up a ripe corken from a table and crunching down into it, a grin upon his face. "A waste of time for you, perhaps, but I have learnt something from your visit." He finished the fruit and gestured for the rest of the repast to be cleared away. Then he strode into his house and down to the halls below. "Open the cellars," he asked 2 of his staff. 2 heavy trap-doors were lifted out of the stone flooring. Krennic grabbed a torch and descended into the depths below via a ladder. "She's gone," he called. "It's safe." Dimly lit by the torch, Krennic could see dozens of barrels stacked in rows, alongside many racks holding bottles in ordered columns. As he stood there, figures emerged from the shadows. Women and girls, some dressed in smart attire, others in the garb of common folk and farm labourers. One woman approached him. He embraced her, hugging her close. It was his daughter. "How is everyone?" "Scared, bored, wondering if they're going to be caught," his daughter answered. "Sitting in the dark is horrible." Krennic nodded. "She'll be back in 5 stretches, most likely sooner," Krennic replied. "How long can we keep doing this?" his daughter asked. "Surely one stretch they will find us, and then—" "There is hope," Krennic said. "This stretch I learned that they failed to subdue some other land they have waged war upon. It appears they are in some distress. This is why they search so hard. I think they've been frustrated in their attempts to attack this other city." "How can this be?" "It seems that there are those who have the power to resist the priestesses," Krennic said. "If we can but contact them somehow." "Scalia might be freed again," his daughter whispered. "Can it be true?" "I will be trying to find out more," Krennic replied. "But such information is hard to come by, and dangerous to seek." "Be careful." "We must all be careful." Gemma stumbled over the roots of a shade, losing her footing and falling to her knees in a soft loam. She stopped to catch her breath, looking about her in dismay. The forest seemed unending. She had no idea how long she had been walking for, only that she was keeping Lakai behind her and heading shadeward. Her stomach was growling. She hadn't eaten since the priestess had rescued her, and the pack of provisions had been lost in the flight from the second priestess. She didn't have anything, not even a knife. She'd hoped to come across a few raw melps or tupes, but the shades were thick overhead, blotting out the light from Lakai. The forest floor gloomy and bare. She got to her feet to take her bearings. She sniffed. There was a faint smell on the air she didn't recognise, sweet yet sharp. Her stomach rumbled again in response. Whatever it was, it smelt like food. Maybe a stash of sweet buns? Some luck after all? She got a sense of which direction it was coming from, somewhere ahead, and set off. The smell grew stronger about her. She could feel her mouth begin to water in anticipation. The shade canopy above seemed thicker now. It was hard to tell which direction she should be heading. The Kai's light was blocked by the trunks, branches and cups above. The smell was thick now. Whatever it was couldn't be far ahead. She stumbled into a small clearing bereft of shades. She squinted in the gloom, seeing a vine hanging down before her. She moved closer, seeing a thick liquid dribbling down it. She reached out, running her hand against it, the sticky liquid dribbling over her fingertips. Definitely the source of the smell. She tasted the liquid. It was sharp but sugary, sticky and gloopy like syrup. She looked up. The vine hung down from the darkness above. She paused to look around, straining her senses in case anything was there. Nothing was moving or making a sound. She began scraping the syrup into her hands. It was a messy affair, but the syrup was good to eat, satisfying her hunger. It would keep her going for a while as she kept travelling. Perhaps she might find more of the vines along the way. Her hands were coated in the stuff by the time she had scraped away what she could reach. As she was licking the last of it from her fingers, she felt a stinging sensation in her ankle. She looked down, wondering whether she'd been bitten by something, only to see a thin silvery thread had wrapped itself around her. She stumbled back, trying to kick it off, but it held fast, elastic and stretchy. She tried to pull at it, but as she did so, more tendrils appeared around her, almost invisible in the gloom, snaking their way around her arms and wrists. She yelled and pulled away, trying to back out of the clearing. She turned, running into a veil of tendrils that had appeared across her path. Those too wrapped themselves around her arms and thighs with a faint stinging sensation. She fell, only to find herself suspended above the ground in the tendrils' grasp. Screaming in horror, she flailed, trying to break the thin tracery that had caught her. But she could get no purchase on the tendrils. They just stretched a little and returned to the same position. More of them spun around about her, binding her fingers together in a sticky mass of white, stopping her from tearing at them. She squirmed, helpless, feeling her body being hoisted up into the air. As she rose, she was rolled over onto her back. She stared upwards. Something hung from the shades above her, a vague shape in the darkness above. A vast beaked bud, surrounded by a cascade of tendrils, was opening. She screamed, heedless of the noise she was making as she thrashed around, helpless in its grasp. The bud peeled back, revealing a dark maw several hands wide. Liquid dripped out, splashing on her. Some of it touched her clothing. She stared in terror as it began to smoke. It dripped onto her skin, burning her. Her screams rose another notch, shrieking out in hysteria. The silent shades about her did not react. Creatures foolish enough to wander into a grasp of a snare were a common enough occurrence in the depths of the forest. And the result was always the same. The snare would feast, slowly, yet surely. Then more tendrils descended, wrapping themselves about the struggling girl. Soon she was enveloped in them, her screams muffled, the numbing anaesthetic stings slowing her movements. She was only jerking spasmodically now. Above, the snare prepared to feast upon its catch. Lord Krennic had set runners to keep him informed as to the whereabouts and activities of the priestesses in Brezia. They came back at intervals through the stretch with news. Only 3 priestesses had been in the city. The others had been summoned away, perhaps due to the problems encountered elsewhere. Nothing new had been overheard as to what those problems were, but the priestesses seemed to be very agitated, exchanging short words with each other, uncomfortable with the situation. Krennic nodded to the latest one as he gave his report. He was a young man, but with a sensible manner about him. Joachim had become a trusted pair of eyes, ears and hands in the last round or so. He had come into Krennic's service when his parents had been killed in the attack on Brezia. Just 3? Yes, sire, Joachim replied. The others left 2 stretchers ago aboard their decks. They haven't returned. Krennic nodded. You've done well. Send one of the others to Brezia upon the next stretch and tell them to keep their eyes and ears open for news. Joachim nodded. Is there something else? Joachim asked. Krennic grinned. We're making a short trip sunward. I'm going to ride to the Shadeward borders, check on the outlying hamlets, see if there are any rumours from beyond our lands. We won't be long. 3 stretchers at most. Have a pair of hergs saddled and provisions made." Joachim nodded and left. Krennic walked out onto the veranda once more, looking across his lands. The priestess's grip is unsure. If we could but learn of these folk that have somehow defied them, how has that been achieved? Some weapon the priestesses are scared of? Or perhaps other folks have found a way to counter their magic? If so, might we ally with them and throw off the shackles imposed upon us by these women? How to reach them? The sunward edges of his lands bordered those of Drayden. A few traders came and went between the two. There was the possibility of some news. It was worth the trip. He leant on the balustrade for a spell, watching the comings and goings of his people. Joachim led 2 hergs out ready for the trip. Krennic could see his sword was buckled to the saddle of his, along with 2 pannier bags loaded with water and food. The young man stood waiting for him below. Krennic turned to see his daughter standing at the threshold of the veranda. "You ride out?" she asked. He nodded. "I must find out more," he said, "if there's anything to be found." She nodded. "Have faith," he said. "The priestesses are not as strong as they would have us believe. Something ails them, worries them, and that works to our advantage." "If they should find us—" "Keep to the plan," Krennic said. "They have not found you in the passes since the battle, and they grow impatient and careless." His daughter looked unconvinced. Can I blame her? Having to hide in the darkness for chimes at a time to avoid being found? He walked over to her, pulling her into a hug. "I know it's hard," he said, "but I would not run the risk of you being taken away to Drayden. We do not know what they do with those they take, but none ever return." He felt his daughter shudder in his embrace. "No, father," she said. "You're right. We will follow the plan. Just don't be long." He hugged her close. "I will be back as soon as I can. I'm taking Joachim. He'll keep an eye on me," Krennic said with a chuckle. "The runners will continue to update us. Look after our folk. The priestesses are not due again for a few stretches. I'll be back before then. Make sure you are." "I love you," he said, stepping back and placing a kiss on her forehead. "And I you." He turned and walked away, signalling to Joachim. The younger man helped him up onto the herg. Krennic gave his daughter a brief wave as he set the beast to canter off sunwards, Joachim following behind. The road was easy for several chimes. It was well travelled, as the farmers that worked his lands were often moving their produce to and from his estates, or onwards to Varezia itself. Beyond that, the road led deeper into the Shadeward forests. The weather was fair, Lakai shining peaceably in the sky for now. 2 of the terrifying flares had hit, but the second one had been less fierce than the first, and his people now knew what to do. Hiding within their homes was the best defence, ensuring nothing flammable was nearby. Failing that, the shade forests were the next best thing, as the shades themselves seemed to cope with the sudden bursts of light by extending their cups to shade the ground below, protecting their own trunks. Afterwards, the cups would shrivel and die within a few chimes, but new ones would grow within a couple of stretches, and the shade forest would return to normal. The rotting husks of the old cups would be consumed by the creatures of the forests. Clearly the shades are ready for the flares. Other creatures seemed to know what to do as well. The hergs retreated into the forests, as did the felons and Kanar. Marsips fled to their burrows. No one knew where the wild dax flew away to, but they had been seen since, high up in the sky. Many people had seen the beast's third eyes, usually sightless, staring around as if measuring something. It seemed they could all tell when the flare was due, and knew what had to be done. A stretcher's ride saw them to the forests close to the border. Ahead, Krennic could see a familiar farmstead belonging to an old friend of his family, the land having been gifted by his ancestors long ago. Smoke was rising from a hole in the roof of a ramshackle building, but as he rode up, Krennic was surprised to find no one was home. Krennic and Joachim tied their herds to a gate and walked inside, seeing a pot of stew bubbling away on a fire, with places set on a rough table for dinner. but there was no sign of anyone. "Where are they all?" Joachim asked. Krennic came out, a frown creasing his forehead. Strange. Hergs were still in the fields about him, but were clustered away from the forest fringes, packed together in a herd. Everything seemed unusually still. Krennic walked back to his Herg, unbuckling his sword from the saddle and taking another look about him. "Come on," he muttered. "Something's amiss here." Joachim pulled his own sword out from its scabbard and stood alongside him. They heard shouts and some kind of commotion from the forest ahead. Raised voices reached him alongside the sounds of trampling undergrowth. Krennic stepped forward and drew his sword. "Brigands, perhaps? If they've hurt any of my people, they will live to regret it." But the figures that emerged from the forest were familiar. Krennic saw his old friend surrounded by his family. Together they were carrying something between them, wrapped up in a bundle, struggling with its weight. He squinted. It looked like a body. Sheathing his sword, he ran forwards, the family seeing him and then recognizing him. Joachim followed close behind. "My lord Krennic," the lead man said. "Fareth," Krennic replied. "I came unannounced, my apologies, but what has happened?" "Someone caught in a snare," he said, gesturing to the body. Krennic could see it was wrapped in linen. "We heard the screams and then cut them down. Likely too late." "Get them to the house then," Krennic said. "I have some medicines with me. Let's see what can be done." Krennic and Joachim pitched in with carrying the body. It wasn't heavy. Whoever the person was, they were small and lightweight. Within the house, space was made and the body lowered to the ground. The linen was unwrapped to reveal a body swathed in fine silky wrappings of the snare. "And what were they thinking getting close to such a thing?" Fareth asked. "Travellers know to avoid them." "Frequent travellers, yes," Krennic said, pulling a knife from his belt and cutting at the tendril coils. "Did you find anyone else? Anything with them?" "Nothing," Fareth said. "We just heard screams and went running. They were alone. No pack, no provisions, nothing." "Strange indeed." Krennic's knife cut through the sticky material and the family helped pull it away. A face was revealed. A young woman with pale skin and blonde hair. "A girl," Joachim said. "She looks familiar. I'm sure I've seen her before." Fareth bent his ear to her mouth. "She's breathing," he announced. Krennic used his knife to cut down the side of her body, and the family continued to pull at the tendrils until they were all removed. The girl's body was battered and bruised, with a nasty burn across her midriff. "Get that cleaned," Fareth instructed. "Snare venom for sure. Make up the fire too." Her clothing was tattered. A simple grey smock, ripped and torn in places, and coated in the tendrils of the snare. She was skinny too, as if she'd gone without food for too long. Before long her wounds were cleaned and dressed with fresh linen. "I'd say you got to her just in time," Krennic said. Fareth nodded. "Half a spell more and the snare would have eaten her." Krennic noticed something and bent forward to look closer. He picked up the girl's limp wrist and turned it over, examining her palm and fingers. "Interesting," he said. "She's not a farm worker, I would guess." "Yeah, skin's too soft. A maid? She's definitely not worked outside, that's for sure." "She's a waif of a thing," Krennic said. "I'd say she'd never scrubbed a floor or carried a pail in her life. Look at her skin. Other than the bruises, it's all smooth. Her fingers are soft and fingernails neat. Not the type to go wandering in the wilderness." "So what was she doing out there?" Fareth asked. "And on her own?" Krennic looked at Joachim. "And you think you've seen her before?" Joachim frowned. "I don't know her, but I'd swear I've seen her in Varezia at some point. I can't place her, though." The girl stared, her eyes blinking open, dark and wide with fear. She panicked for a moment, a scream dying in her throat as she looked at the people clustered around her. "It's all right," Krennic said. "You're safe from the snare." The girl looked at him, breath coming in short gasps. "It caught me." Krennic nodded. "Nasty things," he said. You were lucky to be found by these good folk. And he gestured at Fareth and his family. He saw her look around at them and swallow. Thank you, she managed. Her voice was soft, her accent refined. It was familiar enough too. She couldn't have come from afar. Her pronunciation was Scarlian. A girl of breeding. So why was she out there alone? What's your name, child? Krennic asked. And what happened to you? He saw her tense and swallow again. Please, she said, tell me where I am. This isn't Drayden, is it? Drayden? Krennic asked. Nay, lass, you're in my lands now. This is Scalia. The girl relaxed, her eyes closing with a deep sigh. Then she was crying. Krennic looked at Fareth, who shrugged. He took the girl's hand. What happened to you? He asked, trying to make his voice sound as gentle as possible. I escaped, the girl managed to say. Escaped? Joachim asked. From where? The girl made an effort to stop her sobs, sitting up and wiping at her eyes. After a few deep shuddering breaths, she looked up at Krennic. From Drayden, she said, her eyes wide and dark. From the priestesses. And then she fainted. The girl had been given food and water and had revived in the warmth of Fareth's small house. She had slept for half a stretch before waking again, ravenous for more food. Krennic broke out the provisions he had brought with him and shared them round. Then he, Joachim and Fareth sat with her. This is Fareth, a well-respected man of these parts, Krennic said, introducing his companions. It's he and his family that rescued you from the snare. The girl looked at him and nodded. You have my humble thanks, she said. I thought I was dead. This is my servant Joachim, Krennic continued. The girl looked at Joachim but said nothing. And I am Lord Krennic, Krennic finished with a smile. These lands belong to me. Lord Krennic, the girl said. Of Varesia? Krennic nodded. Yes, the same. And who are you? My name is Gemma, my lord, she answered. I am the granddaughter of Lord Sequon. He took me in after my parents died in the plague. Then that's where I saw you, Joachim said, in the Varesian courts. Sequon, Krennic exclaimed. Then you're one of the chosen tithe sent to Drayden a round ago. Yes, my lord. Prince Torrin took us. She stopped at the look on his face. And she has escaped from Drayden. Krennic sat back and thought for a moment. Can you tell me of Lord Sequon? Gemma asked. Is he well? Krennic rubbed his chin. Alas, he said softly, Lord Sequon is dead. Dead? She wailed. How? Why? Killed by the High Priestess herself, Joachim said, after the city fell. The girl's eyes were wide now. The city? Varesia has fallen? Krennic nodded. The priestesses defeated us in battle. Varesia is theirs now, though it still stands. Tears flooded her eyes at his words. There is no escape from them. Much has happened since you were sent away, Krennic said, but first, how did you escape from Drayden? Are there any others? Gemma shook her head. No, no others. None but me. Then how? One of the priestesses set me free, Gemma said. She smuggled me out of their city, flew me to the borders somewhat of here on a dak. I walked from there, hoping to reach Varesia. Krennic frowned, shaking his head in confusion. But why would a priestess do such a thing? He asked. She said she saved me for Scalia, Gemma said, and that she was of Scalia herself. Of Scalia? Joachim echoed. A priestess? How can that be? Who was she? She was young, Gemma replied. Maybe 5 rounds older than me, but powerful, strong in her ranks, a warrior of their people. Krennic was leading forward now. What was her name? Gemma looked up. She called herself Kiri.